Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So you may be listening to this podcast to find out what your vendors are doing, but guess what? Your vendors are reaching out to me to understand what you are doing. So if you want to know the top 2 reasons vendors reach out to me about you and what you can do to avoid this, keep listening. Welcome to episode 342, Top 2 Reasons Vendors Reach Out to Me About You. And so you may not think about it, but I probably did something wrong with my SEO anyway. But I do have a lot of vendors that contact me, even though I really try to speak to the vendor team or the AP team or the procurement team or whoever has the vendor setup and maintenance function about, the documents to collect, the validations to do, the internal controls to put into place, right? So that you guys avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. But I will tell you, periodically, I get contacted by the vendors too. Now, I'm going to talk about the top 2 reasons, but first, here's a reason that didn't even make it to the top 2 reasons. But I had a vendor reach out to me, and this was like 3 or 4 years ago, and he had there was a fraudulent payment, and his client, meaning you, right? If he were your vendor, sent the payment to a fraudster, and it was because the fraudster was able to hack into his email account. Now, if you don't know what the courts are doing about that, what some insurance companies are doing about that, what some AP teams are doing about that. I did have, and I can't remember it now, but I had a podcast where I talked about the fact that accounts payable teams are not always paying these, especially if it's the vendor's fault. And courts have supported this as well. And I know I did a recent podcast about an outcome of the courts and what they look for, and the fact that the vendor didn't have a secure or didn't have security around their email, which allowed it to get hacked into. Was the cause of a fraudulent email sent from the legitimate email in account of that vendor. And so the accounts payable team or the client, right, did not pay him. And so he called me and I was like, I can't do anything, right? You probably need to talk to your IT folks or whoever you have with your security. And he was still in the midst of it, and I asked him to give me a call back to tell me what eventually happened. He never did, but I get calls about that as well as if I can do anything about fraud when it happens. And it's not a lot I can do about some of the things that you guys put into place. I will tell that they add that the vendors asked me about, but I will tell you that my first and last answer is always you have to do what your client requires you to do, because everyone has things in place for a reason. And even if it's not for a specific reason, if you have an audit in place, or even if you don't, if you have a process in place, you want to make sure that the whole team is following it and not following a vendor who, from wherever they got it from, be it me or somewhere else, has a what they consider an approved process to get set up in your vendor master file. That doesn't really matter. What matters is what you require. So, what I typically tell them, or always tell them, first and last, is that they have to follow whatever your processes are. So, I do get a lot of questions that one about the fraudulent payment and not being paid by the not being, I guess, made whole or reimbursed or paid by the client when the fraud was the vendor's fault, was a big one, but that was the only one that I got contacted about that topic before. It was interesting, but it was only one. And there's one other thing too. I was very surprised that the questions about the W-8 didn't make it into the top two, because those are for the IRS W-8, right? Those are for non US or for foreign persons, right? Individual or entities. And those are the vendors, right, that may not have even heard of the IRS and really don't know how to fill out that W-8, whichever version is applicable for them. They may not even know which version is applicable for them. And I do have some W-8 blogs out there, and I don't get that many questions from them about those. Hopefully, it's not because you guys aren't requiring. I do run into some AP teams more than I do the W-9 that are not requiring the W-8. And I tell the story too. I ran into one team who was asking the vendor if they wanted to fill out the W-8. Well, you know what that answer was. But anyway, I was surprised the W-8s weren't on there. And with that, I'm going to talk about now the top two reasons. And the first one is the biggest reason that vendors reach out to me, and that's because they do not know how to fill out the W-9. Now, you would think the W-9 wouldn't be that hard to fill out, because it is literally, right, line one is their legal name, line two is their DBA. They put their either their employer identification number, EIN on there, their social security number on there, either one. Sometimes they do both. And they also just put one address on there. And I will tell you, I get so many questions about the W-9. And one of the biggest things, too, that surprised me, and I'll put a link to this blog in the show notes, but I have a blog that originated back in 2021, and I update it every year. Uh, but it is the highest ranking of W-9 topics or blogs or links or whatever out there. I trend number one with W-9s, and I know it's not because you guys are doing it. Well, I guess it could be, but I get more vendors that land on this page, and then of course they don't understand it, and so they will reach out to me either via my chatbot or email me. One guy, and this was about 3 weeks ago, he scheduled some time on my calendar, and I wasn't quite clear if he was the vendor or if he was uh, the the vendor setup and maintenance team member. But yeah, he was the vendor. And I tell you what his issue was, and this is what I get from a lot as well, is that when he tried to get set up as a vendor, and this particular client had a vendor self registration portal that automatically did the IRS 10 match, right, with the legal name and tax ID to make sure that combination matched IRS records. It didn't match. And he couldn't understand why. Well, actually, let me take that back. He knew that he had had a name change, but he had made that name change with the IRS. And so he wasn't sure why it didn't work. And this particular client was a very big client, so it wasn't a whole lot that he could do. But when that did not match, their policy was that they would check again in 10 to 15 business days. And he didn't want to wait that long. And so he contacted me. Well, there's nothing that I could do but explain to him that sometimes the IRS 10 match records that you are matching the legal name and tax ID to is not always efficiently updated when there are changes. And so I did explain that to him. And then he was a little bit better with it. But I think he really thought that I would give him something, profound to say that he could take back to his clients to say, to make them, or to, well, I guess that is the right word, make them accept his profile as and then make that be right completed. But it was nothing that I could say. But I will tell you, right. With the W-9s, of the questions that I get, a lot of those questions can be resolved by just having some instructions for the vendor. And so one of those instructions is about, right, if they have recently changed their legal name and tax ID, it may not be updated in IRS records. And by the way, if it's not updated in IRS records, there is a phone number that can be called to allow the vendor to get, if they don't have a letter that indicates what their legal name and tax ID should be with the IRS. And they should have it, although that can be forged, but they should have it. I normally will say go ahead and accept that letter as proof because again the IRS 10 match records may not be updated, and so if you accept that letter that they get from the IRS with their proper legal name and tax ID, then that, and you attach that right to the W-9 along with the unsuccessful validation, and that is your support for setting them up or accepting it if the IRS records, IRS 10 match comes back unsuccessful. Now, some of you may now, because of all the fraud that's out there, refuse to do that. And like this other client did that made them wait 10 to 15 days and then they'll try again. And that's totally fine too. But if you will accept that, then I would make sure that you put that in instructions somewhere so that they know. And then the other thing that I get all the time is the fact that the team member or the vendors just don't know how to fill out that W-9. And I will tell you, I found that when I was a practitioner as well. And many of you already know that I used to be with a Fortune 15 company. I had a team of 17. All we did was vendor setup and maintenance requests. We processed about 2,000 per month. And so that is a lot of W-9s, and that is a lot of IRS 10 matches too. And what I found is that not only sometimes did the vendors not know how to fill out the W-9s, but when they sent that back to my team members, they didn't know if it was filled out correctly or not. And so I'm going to put a link, if that's you and your team, I'm going to put a link to a W-9 training that I have on the Vendor Process Training Center. And you can, if that's something that you or your team members can benefit from, then make sure you enroll and sign up for that. But I will tell you that as a part of that, um, training session, I have a handout that I call the Vendor Non-Official Guidance for Completing the IRS Form W-9. And I know I just heard a couple of gasps out there because we are taught that we are not supposed to guide the vendor on how to complete the IRS Form W-9. But I will tell you from experience where we had a large vendor population that was in that first tax class of individual sole proprietor, used to be also single member LLC, and that description is still that's still the one that a single member LLC would check off. But with the new version of the W-9, it's just individual sole proprietor. But anyway, if you have a large population of vendors that belong to that tax class, they may not know how to fill that out, and you're going to be going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I will tell you that as long as you have a vendor, a W-9 that has a valid legal name and tax ID combination that matches the IRS records, there's not a lot that you can do, right? That will be something that is I guess, giving that vendor the information that they need to. You're not giving it to them, you're just telling them what needs to be put where. And most of you probably know, right? If you've been collecting the W-9 for vendor setup and maintenance for any period of time, that the vendors in that tax class will typically put the name that's on their invoices instead of the legal name that is their first name and last name as the IRS requires. So I do recommend that you have some type of instruction for them, but in that training session for the W-9s, I do have, again, that vendor non-official guidance for completing the IRS Form W-9. And on that, though, I will tell you, I have a link to the W-9 instructions, which we know they vendors probably won't read. But I also have a link to the IRS W-9 video where they show the vendor how to complete the Form W-9. Now, I will tell you, I watched that video about 6 times, and it was only in maybe the last time where I thought it was a little bit helpful. But I know how to fill them out, so maybe for a vendor, it might be okay. I also have on there too, right? If they need to contact the IRS, like I was saying, if they recently changed their vendor legal name or tax ID and is not reflected yet in the IRS records, and they don't have the form that the IRS gave them when they made the change, they can call and get one, that employer identification number, EIN verification letter. When they get it, it's going to be a 147C. That's what it's going to say. But I have the telephone number on there for them as well, so that they can contact the IRS if they need to. And so I have the information that the IRS provides to them all like on one or within that guidance, that non-official guidance. So they can contact the IRS if they need to. But I also have, right, the W-9 kind of marked up, telling them where they need to enter in what. And so that was something that actually came about because one of my Training Pass members said they were having the same problem that I was having as a practitioner with that large volume of vendors in with the tax class or in the tax class of individual sole proprietor, single member LLC, and that they were going back and forth with a lot of those vendors because they just didn't know how to fill out the IRS W-9. And so it is included in there, but you don't have to take that training session in order to get it. What I am saying is, whatever your frequently asked questions are regarding that W-9, whatever issues cause you to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with the vendor, jot those down and make sure that you include them in your instructions back to the vendor. Might save you a couple back and forths. Also, put it in your frequently asked questions so that whoever handles your help desk or vendor inquiries, if they get those questions in, they have an answer that they can copy and paste and put it into an email, or that they can say like a script if you take vendor calls by phone. All right. So the top one was the W-9s, and I should have went backwards, but the next one, you might be surprised about it, but it is that dang on California forms, and I should say two California forms. So I also have another blog post about the California forms 587 and 590, and it's called Do You Need to Collect the California 587 or 590 forms when setting up new vendors? And so vendors land on this one as well. And this one actually came out in 2020, and I do update it every year. Now, if you're not familiar, there are four states that require or may require you to collect additional forms outside of the IRS Form W 9, and California is one of them. They need to know whether or not income tax withholding is required prior to the payment of your new vendor that would be uh, performing work in California, or maybe you are located in California. And so there are two forms. The form 587, that's for non-resident withholding allocation worksheet. So that's supposed to be completed by non-residents, and based on their responses in the payment type section, withholding may or may not be required. And then Form 590, that is the withholding exemption certificate. So this form is to be completed by California residents or non-residents for which one of the exemption reasons apply based on entity type and or resident status. So I'm not going to get into the details of the forms here. I will put a link to the blog post about the forms. And for those of you that are Training Pass members, I do have a training session on the states that you need to determine if you need to collect those state forms from your vendors. And I think there are four of them. There's California, Nebraska, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania. I don't know. I don't think there's been a new one, but I haven't done that one yet this year, and so I'll do some additional research because I do it live every year, and then it is available to watch on demand until the next year when I do additional research and then see if anything is updated and then do it live again. All right. So, with all that being said, I get this question a lot because vendors don't know how to fill out this form either. But I think the biggest thing that stops them before they even get started is really part one. And part one is on both forms is the withholding agent information. And that is something that if you don't fill it out when you send it to your vendor, first of all, we used to collect this W 9 when I was a practitioner with that team of 17, or not W 9, but we used to collect both forms, and we would actually send both forms to the vendor to determine which one they need to fill out. So they didn't know which one to fill out. And then when they did identify which one to fill out, they started with, right, that first section, and it is the withholding agent information. And we got smart eventually and filled that piece out with our information. But I will tell you, that's not what everyone is doing. And hopefully, if that's something that you haven't pre-filled out before you give it to the vendor, you'll want to start doing that because they have no idea what to put in that section. And I will tell you too, that I have worked with a couple of third-party vendors, self-registration portal providers that provided or had the state forms in their portal, and they pulled the vendor's information for that section because, right, it's a vendor form. The vendor has to fill it out. The assumption is that you have to put the vendor information there, right? Thinking back to the W 9, but no, your information goes in there. So I get that question all the time about what should they put in that field, and that field is really your information. So what you can do to avoid that is to just, or to avoid that question, is to just put your information in the withholding agent information field or section. It's a field on the California Form 590, and it's a section on the California Form 587. Just fill it out before you give it to the vendor. Now, they may have other questions, right, about the form, but at least they won't have a question before they even get started filling it out. All right. So those are the top two reasons why I get vendors reaching out to me about what you guys are doing. It's all about the W-9, and it is all about the California Forms 587 and 590. And my biggest recommendation is to make sure you have instructions and make sure you fill out your piece of that California 587 and 590 before you give it to the vendors. All right, so that is it for today. And I hope you got some value out of today's podcast. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 342nd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.